Hello, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Ramazan Mubarak to all of you. I hope that this, is a month of peace for all of us, and wherever we are, we maybe find it and maybe cherish it. I am really, really honored today to host Dr. Matthew Parent, who is the Impact and Outreach Coordinator for the Project on Managing the Atom here at the Belfer Center and Howard Kennedy School. He is a newly minted PhD, and we all are so proud of him. He serves as a faculty assistant for Professor Matthew Bunn here. Before coming to the Kennedy School, Matthew was an adjunct professor of political science at Clark University and the University of Connecticut, teaching courses related to international relations and security studies. Matthew also served as a graduate assistant and researcher at the Center for Judaic Studies at UConn. Matthew also coordinates the various fellowship programs at Managing the Atom. He holds a BA in political science from the University of Massachusetts, an MA in world politics from Catholic University of America, an MA in political science from UConn, a graduate certificate in human rights from UConn's Human Rights Institute, and a PhD in political science from UConn. His dissertation analyzes public perceptions of military technology, reviewing both material capabilities as well as popular culture, and it is titled Shaping the Battlefield Assessing the Symbolic Role of Military Technologies. An extremely important topic, and I hope in coming years we will read more scholarship from Dr. Parent on his dissertation. So, with this, over to you, Matt. We are really honored to have you here. We have a bunch of students here who are, some are in doctoral programs, some are in master's and MPhil program, and we are all eager to listen to you in this research methods class. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Rabia. So that very lovely introduction. I appreciate that. It is always exciting to hear Dr. Parent these days. So for those of you in the PhD program, I promise you it is worth it. It is very cool when that eventually does happen. And it's a lot of work. And for the master students in the mix as well, you know, great on you all for delving into research methods and putting the time and effort in, because I'm a firm believer that these skills will translate to everything you do in life. Uh, Understanding how research is shaped, formed, and executed, I think is extremely important in any field, in every field. And putting the effort into doing this work will make you a more informed person. It will set you up when you're reading the news or dealing with policy issues or whatever you do. I think you're going to be one of those people who then understands when things are good and sound scholarship, and when they're people are trying to pull the wool over your eyes and trick you, and you can tell when methods are bad when you get to a certain point. And so this is great stuff that you all are doing with a great professor, may I add. One of my favorite people, Rabia. So with that, we'll get going. So the title we've gone with is Text as Data, a positivist approach to text analysis in political science and international relations. And we'll kind of go through every piece of what that means, and a lot of the smaller conversations, or more focused conversations, I should say, around the various pieces of that title. So we're all on the same page and we're learning as we go. So I don't really need to spend a lot of time on this. Currently at Managing the Atom, where I help manage the fellowship programs. Spent a lot of time at the University of Connecticut, and of course teaching at Clark University and at UConn, mostly around security studies, human rights, and international relations. Um, of note, I did go to the Institute for Qualitative and Multi-Method Research, which is a consortium here in the US. I'm not sure how people are selected to go anymore. At the time, it was institutions that were members of it would send people. I think there is an application process. But if you look up at IQMR, there's more information. And that's held at Syracuse University in the summers for about 2 weeks. If you have a deep interest in these methods, it's probably worth looking into. I had a great time there. It was very, very helpful. I made outstanding connections to researchers and scholars. So I can look into getting links for that to Rabia to pass along after if I have anything new to pass on there. Also, that picture is of us, of your professor and I in Turkey, actually, in Istanbul. I look much younger there. I've aged quite a bit in like 2 years, so we need to solve that.
PhD does that to you, man.
It's true. I have a streak of gray hair now. Um, so just to kind of get into what I study, I think it's important to kind of set the stage because one of the things that I believe is important as a researcher myself is to understand that I'm born in a tradition, in a particular field, with a particular perspective, which does influence the way I view even these fundamental issues. So I think it's important just to go through what I study here and how that does that. So for myself, I'm a political scientist. I have a heavy influence of history in my research, but I am a political scientist. And in the United States in particular, I think that has a connotation, especially from a methods perspective, of the way we look at questions and how we delve um, into these issues. And then within political science, I study international relations, the interaction of states within the international system. And across the world, but even in the US, there is kind of a competing interest of is international relations the same as political science? Some departments they're not, some they're combined. For instance, the University of Delaware here in the US, they mention both. Um, so within that, international relations is often split into political economy, international political economy, and security studies and international organizations, and maybe more. I tend to be in what's known as the security studies kind of niche within that, right? And your professor is in particular a wonderful scholar in the security studies space. And we have our own traditions, which probably draw more on the historical side than most of the subfields. Okay, so keeping that in mind, um, and then within that, right, and this is for the PhD students out there, or for the master students really jumping into a thesis, it's interesting, I think, to see the ways that you start to get more and more narrow in your interests and what that does to the possibilities within your research. So then within security studies, rather than focus on like state government systems, I look at military technology and political change, the weapons that people use to fight wars. And so that focus and emphasis dictates that I have to do certain types of research and answer certain questions given the audiences that I have to deal with. So, for instance, a good example of why this is relevant is when I talk about laser weapons or firearms. I know that I'm going to be, and nuclear weapons is a great example of this. We're going to be dealing with engineers or weapons experts or military specialists that really understand the kinetic nature of these weapons. I'm not saying that I need to know how to take apart and rebuild a gun, but I'm saying it's probably a good idea that I know some of the technical details, even if it's not directly relevant to the questions I'm asking. And then this is where I really kind of pivot is the symbolism in military technology. This moves me into kind of an uncomfortable space where I have to learn the technical side of something and then also the more theoretical and academic focused literature that's out there. Um, the studying symbols has a lot of different terms. Semiotics is one that you've probably heard in different forms. Uh, the study of symbols and communication. We have symbolic interactionism out of sociology. There are many types of studies of symbols. And so that's kind of my roadmap that I draw for myself. Yeah, Rabia.
Um, can you also, before you get into the how do you study these issues, um, can you talk to these students as to how did you know that this is what you want to do?
Oh yeah, that
That's-
absolutely.
Yeah.
So when I applied for my PhD, I was not going to study these issues. I had initially applied, and for the master students, if you're looking into a PhD, it's great to have an idea of what you want to study. It might change, but it's good to know. I mean, it's essential, especially if you're looking at Europe or any PhD program where you come in directly to write with no coursework. In the US, you have coursework beforehand, so it depends. Um, but I actually came in to study regional politics and regional politics of East Asia. Um, my first publication ever was actually in an Indian journal, and it was about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and potential new members. I actually have a history of South Asian publications, so we'll go with that.
Wow,
Um,
I did not know that, man. We need to talk more.
yeah, I should find it because it was they had changed the name. It was a great. The journal had a very like normal, kind of boring name, something like the Indian Economic Journal, and they changed it to the Great Indian Dream.
Wow.
Um, yeah, a very grandiose title, but it was pretty. It looked pretty good. Whether people read it or not, I don't know. But it was. I was tucked between a couple ambassadors, so I figured it had to be somewhat
Yeah.
credible. I was young. But point being, I studied regional politics at the time. Um, but because of that, and I think for those of you who kind of study weapons, a lot of the relationships that you see in regional conversations have to do with weapons and procurement of technology. And so I kind of started diving down that angle, and how the different actors would discuss these issues with each other led me to really start getting an interest in symbolism. Because a lot of people will say, well, it's symbolic, it's symbolic. And I'd say, of what? And no one really had a great answer. And sometimes if you looked into it, they'd be different. So that's really kind of where my interest in these issues came from. It actually was born of more typical regional politics. And this is the part where, as you do your research early, when you're coming up with topics, I think it's useful to keep an open mind. And we're going to go through this later, how you do this and the things you can do when you're putting research together to really move in the right direction, uh, and use the tools that are going to help answer the questions that you have. So for myself, how do I study these issues? So you can see kind of this descending cascade of the things that I study. And if anyone has questions throughout, feel free to raise your hand and jump in. I'm more than happy to field questions. We'll pause at the end for some, but I also want people to know you can jump in at any point. Um, so, how do I study these things? Each of these pieces has its own tradition, especially from like security studies, IR, and political science. So, and it depends on where you are. So, political science in the US has become more heavily quantitative. There's a real kind of emphasis in statistics and data analysis in that regard. It's not exclusive, though. I mean, there are plenty of people who don't do that, but it's become an emphasis, especially in voting behavior, in American political institutions, um, in comparative politics. It's moved in that direction. It used to be less so, and it's moved in that direction. Political theory still kind of protects itself from it, but it's even kind of getting into that. And even someone as myself who has a more historical focus, and as we'll get into, um, I do kind of an interpretivist approach to cultural studies. Um, Even I had to go through some statistics and methods. It comes with the territory, at some level. But when I get into my research, how I study these things is I tend towards these qualitative approaches, which we'll get into what that means. And text analysis is one, and I've used it in a number of forms, both quantitative and qualitative. But my own research, as I've kind of developed my skill set, it tends towards qualitative approaches. Now, that's not just because I don't want to use numbers, but rather the questions I ask are typically served by qualitative approaches. And I think that's the guiding principle. And we'll discuss what that means later. But it's important not to force yourself, I think, into one approach or another, but rather look at the tool that is most useful for the questions that you have. And there may be more. There may be more than one tool. So we'll discuss that. So for politics and political science, I'm actually interested when we study politics. What do people think of that? When you think of studying politics or government, what do we mean? Like very big level. So if you tell someone, "Oh, I study politics or I study government," what does that mean? And Robbie, if you actually I would say if you have a take on this, I'm interested too.
So I'm not a core political scientist because I wanted to move away from domestic nature of politics and look at international politics. But I think, this line that you have there, it is about power, whether it is domestic or international. And that is the central core tenet of how actors and states, actors at the domestic level, the second level of analysis, and the international system, it's all about power. So that's where it starts from, and that's what it's all about. To
Um,
me,
yep.
Go ahead, Ali.
Yep. So more specifically, yes, power. So I look at politics as the formation of power, the distribution of power, and the exercise of power. And I'm not talking about coercion. So that's part of it. But as Dr. Rabia rightly said, it's about how power is, we study how power is used as a means by actors to influence other actors in different ways. It could be coercive, it could be non-violent, it could be anything. But at the end of the day, it's about the formation of power and the processes involved in distributing power and using power to good effect.
Good. Yeah, I like that. I kind of condition a response, right, when I put that power thing up there. But I think it's a useful way to understand when we talk about studying politics and international relations to think about things. And I think the point of it can include coercion, it can also include many other things, is important. So with what I look at, which we'll talk about later, of these symbolism, I think a lot of it can be coercive if it's purposeful, but it can also be very much just persuasive in its use, and it can do so in a quiet way. Um, there's the Max Weber, the philosopher, right? It's the who gets what, when, and how. That's his definition of politics, and uh, I believe it's his definition. If I might be misattributing that. So apologies if I am. But that who gets what, when, and how, I think is a good way that I summarize power. And fitting into like what is the role of this study, I think of economics. We study markets, right? Sociology, the structure of social systems. I think politics is really about this idea of power, and so that colors how I look at international relations. And I think anyone that looks at international relations and international behavior uses power in some way, okay? Um, and when we look at the behavior of states in the international systems, and I use systems in an important way because I believe that there is both a large structure over all state behavior, and then there are also smaller ones, right? We have regions, we have individual bilateral relationships with countries that matter too. And then there are a number of factors that influence state behavior. So when I study things, this is how I do it. And in social science, no matter what you're studying as you move forward in your career, it could be different, right? If it's not politics, it's something else. And I think it's good to have a core understanding of what your frame of reference is as you move forward in the study of both your field and your question. Um, because ultimately you're embedded within this broader field. And I think that's an important thing to understand, that you're speaking to a literature and you're speaking to issues that exist already. That's the value we have when we do research, is that we can build upon knowledge and place our new things into these places. Um, so what kinds of questions can you think that relate to this? So we don't have to stop here, actually. But I think it's good to think of the questions that can relate to this. We do have a hand up. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Adin, Adin, go ahead, please.
So thank you, Matthew. I just wanted to ask that isn't limiting the politics just to the aspect of power is limiting it, because it is, in my view, it is just one part of the politics. And if we talk about uh, democracies, if we talk about representation, it is more about public service, negotiation, conflict resolution, and a lot more things which are included in politics. So I would like to have your point of view on this.
Yeah, I think that's fair, right? To discuss the variety of things that you can approach in whatever this means, right? And so there are some distinctions in this field of political science or politics as well. And I think it speaks to kind of this, well, what is included in this broader discussion? So in the US, we have political science departments and we also have government departments. That's usually the breakdown. What is the difference? It kind of is arbitrary here, it seems like, but I do think there is a bit of an emphasis in government when we talk about government instead, to also include kind of the practice and institutions in a more practical way, where we may be more inclusive of public policy, for instance, which I think also speaks to some of that. I actually worked with the negotiation program here at the Kennedy School for my first year and a half too. So I agree that that kind of has its own unique like mini field within what's happening as well. Now, this distinction probably doesn't hold up uh, everywhere, right? I know that in Europe there are politology departments, right, which more along the lines of sociology, where they jettison the adherence to science as a like the scientific. I think they probably still use the scientific method, but it's just not directly in the name. Um, and so I think it's good to question these kind of fundamental what I'm talking about. And that's why, I make sure in my bullet point, I say my study of politics, right? That's kind of the way that I embed what I do. And so I think it's good that you're asking those questions or thinking those thoughts of, well, I actually have, an emphasis here or here. And it's good to be able to articulate that. And if you have a relative skill in that, it's even better, right? You're able to say to the people that you're discussing these issues with, well, I believe that this is important, right? The structure of a negotiation or the role of communication in this, right? It may not be unique to this one piece of power. It's also important to note that this is a very interdisciplinary field. So it includes more historically minded people. It includes direct historians that discuss politics. So within history, there's an entire field called diplomatic history. And that has it's kind of like international relations. They speak a lot of the same language, but they come from a historical background. So the way they look at issues is just a little bit different. Even within international relations, I think security studies folks and international political economy folks speak a little bit of a different language as well. Um, And then there is kind of this third international organizations bit that comes up sometimes. And I actually think the international organizations area in the international space relates to the comment that you made. There's a lot more discussion of process and institutions and how bureaucracies affect things. It looks like you're trying to say something, but I think you're muted. No? Okay.
No, thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you.
All right. Excellent. Very good question. So, yeah, this is kind of the, it's important to think of the questions that can relate to these things, right? And you can do this individually as you move forward and will as your studies go forward. So the how do we answer these questions, okay? And so we're going to get really into the details and a little bit. And this is a thing for me. There is a difference between methods and methodology. And it's one of those things that it sounds really, really pedantic and annoying, but I promise you, for people that know the difference, if you speak at a conference or present your research and you use the wrong term here, people will know. They may not judge you to your face, but it is a thing. So, does anyone know the difference between method and methodology?
The how and why, Matt.
Yeah, Ali.
The specific is methods. The specific tools are methods, and the more generic or general forms of analyses, I think, come in the ambit of methodologies.
So I think that's close. I think the only corrective I'd add is that methodology is also the justification for the method that you use, right? Just like Rabia said, see, you all are trained well. You have a good professor, so you will know these differences and move forward. But yes, I think of methodology as the justification for the method that you're using. So when you write a research paper and you have a methodology section, it's not methodology to say I did interviews. It's not a methodology to say I did a literature review. Those are methods, right? And then you have to say why those methods were useful or are useful to answering your question. I know that seems really pedantic, and you've probably already discussed this, it sounds like a little bit. But I think it's important to know this difference because it really sets you up for success when you're picking the tools to do your research. And that's kind of what the remainder of the talk is going to be, is figuring out what tools you should be using and how you're going to do that. Methodology should be relatively straightforward. You should be able to articulate the why for how you do your research. And you'd be surprised at the amount of people who can't do that. Okay. And this is one of my major criticisms, oftentimes, of very heavily statistic focused American political science is that, well, why did you do a survey? Why did you run a regression? Well, because I know how and it looks impressive. I think those aren't good reasons. I'm not saying these are bad tools, they're very useful tools. But sometimes people have a question and then they change the question to match their method. And I think that's probably not the best way to do this. Now, that's a judgment call on my part, but I think it does happen. And so I think it's good to at least know what we're doing as we move forward with that. What tools do we have? We often break it down between qualitative and quantitative methods. I also have an emphasis on interpretive methods. Now, I don't think they're fully divorced from these. I think they're kind of used in both, and we'll get into that, why that is. And this is kind of why we talk about a positivist approach to political science, which again, we'll get into that, positivism and post-positivism. And I think it's really important to know the tools, and that's why this is really good that we're talking about this. I think because text analysis and these more qualitative approaches, they have a use, but it's important to know what those uses are and when they're appropriate. Now, we're going to take kind of a step back here to make sure that we're dealing with kind of the foundations of these, right? Now, what do we mean by science in political science? And you may not be political scientists, right? And that's okay. But here, in the institutions I've been brought up in, we play to this idea of science. So what does it mean to do science, right? That you follow the scientific method. And it may not be as distinct as when you're doing an experiment in a lab. Okay, that's totally fine. But this idea that you have a hypothesis that you're testing, that you're invigorating that test with data and coming back, and there may be some more recursive steps where you go backwards and then forwards than you would in some cases, but that's kind of what we mean, that we're going to follow the scientific method as we look to answer questions. And you don't really have to follow this rigidly. I mean, I think plenty of people have worked around this and have maybe some narrative forms to answer questions, but I think that's what people generally mean, is that they're using the scientific method to answer their questions. Now, this second bullet point of, can we really know these answers, right? It's a social science. If you say, what affects state behavior in nuclear weapons decision making? My argument is you probably can't know, but you can probably find reasonably what has influenced people or what may influence people. And I think part of this is that just because questions are difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't look at them. I know there was a lot of double negatives in that sentence, but the point being, people are complicated. Many people are even more complicated. And just because these situations are complex, we should still look at them. All right. Even if we aren't absolutely sure that our findings are 100% accurate or our predictions are going to always be true, the belief is that when we do this work, we're getting a little bit closer to the truth. And even if it's just the truth in a particular instance at a particular time. Okay. And that's where historians will really look at me and say, well, this is what we try to do, right? They try to find the essence of what happened. And sometimes they're just going to say political scientists do too much to try to guess what's going to happen next. And I think that's probably fair. Okay. And that's the best we can sometimes do. Now, what does it mean to be a positivist or post-positivist? Now, this is a debate it was more prevalent, I actually think, in the 2000s. I think we've kind of moved past this and people just pick a side. Now, positivism is the concept that you can build replicable data, or you can build knowledge that everyone can share and that a field can agree upon. A post-positivist would say, I'm not trying to say that I'm building knowledge. I'm just doing this thing that's my impression. It's unique to me. You and I don't share the same background, expertise, history, cultural affiliation. The best I can do is write down my thoughts, and you can either agree with them or disagree with them, and we can have these conversations, but building universal knowledge probably isn't going to happen. Okay, so I'm sure that's not the most specific definition of what that is, but that's kind of my understanding and belief of what the distinction is. Now, as someone who studies movies and video games and kind of media outreach and the different forms of text that exist, we often get lumped as interpretivists into this concept that we're post-positivist because we spend so much time interpreting the various pieces of data from our own unique perspective. How could we ever be building knowledge that everyone can share? And my argument is that when I do that and I outline and am aware of my background and specifics, it allows other people to reflect on that information with that. And if we find commonality, that's how we move forward. So that's kind of my approach. Yes, there's a question, Arfa.
Yeah, my question is slightly about the previous point where you're talking about the post-positivist approach. So I just wanted to ask, do you think that moving beyond positivism means that people have now begun to view the world around them in a postmodernist way, where things are very relative to you and they want to, they want to have their own perspective. It can be different from the other person, but then, becoming more postmodernist in their approach. Can we say that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a related concept, right? That this postmodern uh, world is one in which it is, like you said, relative, right? That the best we can do is articulate our relative interpretation or relative perspective on these issues. And I think some people
Mm,
will own that label, and I think that's totally fine. And I think if we're self-aware about it, then
mm,
and are upfront about it, then that places your research within a field or even just within an approach that lets people understand what you're going for. So
mm,
I think as long as people are self-aware, it
mm,
also insulates you a bit from criticism when someone may look at your work and say, this is uh this isn't building on anything. What are you trying to do? Well, maybe you have a perspective that that's not possible, right? And that's the fundamental thing, that there are people,
mm,
and I think postmodernism is often embedded in this, right? That you
mm,
you can't do that, right? That even though people say they are building knowledge, it's kind of a farce, or it is not quite that useful. So I
mm.
think the best we can do is be self-aware as scholars and make sure to highlight what that means to us as we develop our methodology sections, or as we discuss kind of how we move forward with our
Yeah,
question.
yeah, yeah. As long as we can defend what we want to do scientifically and
Yes.
logically. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
And I think it's okay to say this isn't science. I mean, if you're doing something and saying, this is how I am looking at it,
Mm,
and this is why, and the why can be fundamental. It can be, I don't agree with, the way that most people have answered this question for a long time. I think
mm,
that they're, not looking at the right things, or they're overstating the effectiveness of how they study things. Um,
mm.
So, pro- I think as long as you're self-aware about it, I think it's a good um, kind of way to move forward.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've already kind of discussed this a bit, but what is interpretivism and how does it relate to research? Now, my argument is that most things that we do involve interpretation. And even the scientists who say, no, it's quantitative, I've done a survey or whatever, they're interpreting data. Even if you're assigning a number or coding something. And the same is true with qualitative methods, right? When we're writing a narrative of a particular event, process tracing or case studies or whatever we do, we're interpreting the world around us. We're interpreting the research in front of us. We're interpreting the pieces of data that we're using. Okay. Now, does this hinder how scientific a field is? Maybe, but I mean, I think it's better to be complicated and accurate than it is to be simple and wrong. And so that kind of guides why I feel the need in some of these instances to interpret things. And in the space of military technology, and Rabia can attest as we sit in our seminars every week, lots of details bog people down. And you get to the end of a 30, 40-minute conversation, and not much has been said. You know, when you think about a gun, there's a lot that goes into firing that bullet. But at the end of the day, if you're more concerned about what happens with the person who gets hit by the bullet, those things matter very little in the consequences of things. And so, I think there's a space for many, many different approaches. And this is not me saying any of them are right, wrong, better, or worse. My argument is just there are many approaches. As long as we're self-aware of what our approach is and how we do things, this is the usefulness of kind of the human condition, right? That we have different interests and different experiences. And I think to me, that's how we move forward. So now text analysis, this is kind of the interesting frame I think we're bringing here. It's not just written text. Okay. What we mean by text analysis is that it's inclusive of a variety of things in the world. So it includes visual media, oral histories, speeches, all of these things. Okay. The written word is included here, but it's also inclusive of different forms of communication. Um, how are these helpful? Um, I believe that in addition to seeing what's written down, we can also think of why things were written down, of or created. You know, who is the audience that we're trying to convey information to? Does the audience matter to what the information is? Do they perceive information differently? The other thing that I find interesting about texts or these kind of, articulated pieces of information is that it's always a game of figuring out how much the people producing them were trying to influence behavior. Think about the way that you write things down or say things, right? Some things are very quick, obvious. You're just trying to convey clear information. Other times, think about when you go into like a job interview or something. You really curate and cultivate particular types of information, trying both to convey more information or less with the same amount of words. And these are the kinds of things that we get into when we're studying a variety of texts. So, I think about sometimes, you know, the types of clothes that you wear when you do something. That's a form of communication and influence, right? When you're dressed a certain way, or it may be unspoken, but it may be important to how you try to communicate. And then I have a definition here. I forgot to add the link. This was just something I found. I thought it was a good general description, so I apologize. This is bad scientific behavior to not cite appropriately. I got halfway there. I put quotation marks so that it's not my words. But if you ever get into the habit of when you're citing to put will find later, that's a really bad one for reasons like this, because sometimes you don't go back and do that. But keep in mind, this is a very generic definition. You'll find something like this in many, many books and articles. So, this isn't unique to me. It's not particularly insightful. I think it's a good general description of what text analysis is as a method, right? Not a methodology, as a method that involves closely and critically examining written, spoken, or visual messages. All right. And this latter portion is why I liked this, because it discusses, not just what's in front of your face, but the underlying kind of information, and trying to understand intention, motivation, and perspectives. And so in doing something like looking at symbols, it's very important to have this latter portion. I'm trying to deconstruct many, many forms of information to understand why people perceive things the way they do. I also think an interesting thing about text analysis to think about, and I'm not fully sure how we integrate this into the broader kind of social science method, but when we talk about things like visual messages, blind people exist, deaf people exist, and we don't have a really good understanding of the way that disability or just different forms of communication really influence our understanding on this. I think it's also interesting to know, if your native language is different. I'm an English speaker, a native English speaker. I probably have a different reaction to many of the things that are out there than to someone who has a different language background or multiple language backgrounds, right? So even that I think is important. I don't think we have a particularly good way to unpack this. Again, I think if we're aware of and kind of forward thinking about how we do this, that's probably one of the better ways to approach it. And it's not simple, it doesn't solve problems, but I think it at least lets us understand where we're coming from. So now we're going to go through kind of how I have done this. Okay. And I've done both. And so this here in front of us I've snapped it. This was the journal that I got this published in with my former professor, Stephen Dyson, where we did a text analysis that was quantitative. Okay. So what we were looking at was trying to understand. Now, keep in mind, this was 2018. The research was up until early 2017. Um, it was about how Vladimir Putin, like we were looking into his personality and decision making. So what we did is we used this thing called the operational code approach. It's an old CIA approach to profiling leaders. And it used to be that you would take speeches and do it by hand, and you would put values on different phrases in English. And those phrases would, they were analyzed in a psychological way that had been designed and developed. And you could then identify different personality traits. So what we did is we took every speech Vladimir Putin gave, translated into English, keep that in mind, and I hand coded it all into different text files based on topics. So we had like 1 million words. There's a lot because this method only relies on a couple thousand. So we did a huge one. And then we ran it through a program that did all the addition, like did the numbers for us, did the coding of the individual words for us. And what we did is we compared that to the speeches of more typical world leaders. So I think it was George Bush, Tony Blair, uh, and Angela Merkel, something like that. And then, so we had a kind of a corpus of text to compare it to there. And then the other one was Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-il, so like more what we kind of see as like revisionist world leaders. And we compared kind of how Putin related to that. So he actually, believe it or not, sounded much more like a typical Western leader over that time frame. I'm actually really interested to go back and redo this with the more recent years with the war that's going on, because I wonder if his language has shifted in his public speech.
It would be
It'd
a
be
great comparative. You should do that, Matt. Would be
Yeah, and we did it by topic, and so within this, any mention of terrorism, he actually tacked way closer to the revisionist world leader thing, and separatism was viewed as part of that. And we have like 1.5 years of analysis around Crimea, and it was similar to that. So my guess is in relation to this, he probably gets closer to that. I just wonder if his like international talk would also do it, given how things have degenerated in the world system since then. And so, text analysis here in this article, as a quantitative approach, there was a level of interpretation in this too, right? I put blocks of text into particular sections based on what I believe they were related to. And I can tell you, I did my best, but Vladimir Putin does every winter a like multi-hour interview where he takes questions from around Russia. Well, I'd be sorting through, you know, 50 plus pages of these answers. And you do that for hours and hours and hours. You probably your how you do that may change a little bit. Now, you can automate it, but automating also has its own weakness. It may put things in the wrong buckets just because computers aren't smart. Computers just follow rules. Okay, so they're going to just put things where they think it should go. So there's their own issues there. So this is how I've used text analysis, where you interpret speeches and you're trying to make claims in personality. We also had a qualitative bit to this where we tried to understand some of it, right? That some of his survivalist mentality is probably born of working in the then Soviet Union intelligence apparatus. He was in an area where he knew he needed to survive and have backup information and resources. And so we did some of that too. And I think that's important when you're doing research to understand even a little bit just how other people, may interpret that data, and try to put yourself in other people's shoes to understand that. Now, this part, my dissertation, this is my bigger research project, is called Shaping the Battlefield, Assessing the Symbolic Roles of Military Technology. So what I did here is I looked at symbols as a frame to understand, the shared understandings of weapons, that there are similarities between the way people interpret weapons that are out there. And so I thought, well, I think a good way to do this is symbols. I think symbols are inherently shared, right? They resonate with people and societies that in a way that I think is useful. And even if you as an individual don't believe that the weapon is accurately represented by that symbol, you know that other people do. And even that, I think, is useful because it gives you an ability to speak to that symbol, even if you don't believe it is. And we see that a lot, I think, in practitioners, that they'll say, well, I know too much about this. I don't view the weapon in that way. But they have to speak to that symbol because they know other people do. And so I'm actually going to pull up my other PowerPoint here of my dissertation, if that's okay. Looking at time, Rabia, so it's like 10 of.
So we have an hour, and
Okay.
yeah. So because we are, taking questions side by side, so it's okay. You
Okay,
can.
cool. I'll try to do like 15 more minutes and then we can take questions. And then I have an exercise too if we want to run through that at the end. All right. Ooh. There we go. All right. So these are my slides for my dissertation, okay? So we'll move through some of this. So part of why I did this, I think people have not paid attention to these symbols of these technologies as much. So that's why this was my justification for doing this. So this is how I did it. Okay, so in looking at these symbols, I said, well, what informs our understanding of these items? And I said, well, material capability. You can't ignore it, I don't think, right? If a nuclear bomb can destroy a whole city, it's probably important to know that and know why.
Matt,
Um,
sorry.
yeah.
Can you explain briefly what symbols were you looking at? Like, can you give an example? So, and then.
Yes. Yeah. So we'll get into that. So the three types of weapons I looked at. So I looked at nuclear weapons and technologies as one. Then my second empirical chapter was about the Kalashnikov and the M16 rifles. And then my third were laser weapons and autonomous systems. And the reasons for this are nuclear weapons were the most devastating weapons. Rifles are kind of the most personal small arm that a military uses. Excuse me. And then lasers and robots are because one of the pieces of data I evaluated was cultural artifacts. And robots and lasers have the most influence from those. Now, what symbols were there? Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Was it in relation to their destructive capability? That's.
So all of these pieces of data inform the symbols. So it was a bit iterative. So I had ideas of what it could be, but I had to deep dive to see what was common, and then I identified those symbols. And so kind of the exercise of the dissertation was discussing what those symbols were. And so I think, let me see here. So you know how dissertation presentations go. They go very fast and it's mostly questions. So these are not like the most informative slides. But here, so with nuclear weapons, right? My argument was that they both simultaneously had symbols of annihilation, Armageddon, the end of the world, but they also coexisted with symbols of extreme prestige and advancement for a country. And to me, this is kind of what got me going on this entire dissertation. I think it's a really uncomfortable thing that we can, in our minds, hold a technology to be both world ending and great and prestige and strong for a country to have. On its face, if there's something that can destroy the world, a new technology that didn't exist in nature that can destroy the world, one would think we as people would find a way to understand that this is probably not good for us to have. When in fact, quite the opposite has happened, in that there are people that justify it as modernization and how you become a contemporary state. And so understanding things like proliferation or non-proliferation, I think, are more interestingly formed when we can look at both of these symbols in and understand, how do these symbols form? And so with the variety of data that I put up earlier, the history of use, the development of the weapon, the capability, and then how it's represented in culture, every technology has a different kind of scale as to the influence of those. But I thought nuclear weapons were interesting here because it has a history of all of those things. There's researchers have looked at all of them. And in fact, in popular culture, this was the text analysis portion primarily of this. It was the kind of cultural representations. And I did a lot of legwork to understand, the way that movies and video games and comic books and things like that would really kind of influence our understanding. And it works both ways, right? The people creating it were conveying a message, the people understanding it are interpreting a particular message, and then they're being constantly reinterpreted as society goes on. And so this is the kind of difficulty in, what is science, what is positivist or post-positivist, because I think it's one of those things that's iterative. It's a process that changes and moves and is constantly adapting. I think the best we can do is at this point in time say this about this issue. And this is another thing I encourage us as researchers to do as we move forward. When you're looking at articles or data, secondary sources, primary sources, whatever you're doing, it's really good to see when this was produced and the context these things were produced in. In particular, when you're reading like journal articles or academic books, I think it's really, really important to look at when these were written and some of the debates that were around. And you may not know all of them, but as you become more senior in a field, I think it's so useful when well, this article was written in the late 90s, post-Cold War, economic boom, whatever. All of those things I think inform why certain things may have been relevant then and may not hold as time goes on, or may, history may not repeat, but it rhymes, as some people say. It's sometimes good to know that too. So I used text here to really understand these weapons. So, for instance, the symbols in the small arms section, there was a really, really strong symbol of kind of the West, or like U.S. and its allies, and then for the M16 and the Kalashnikov, which many, many countries have, but a universal character to it was that all of American adversaries in conflict had this weapon. And so it's not unique to American adversaries, it's just ubiquitous. And how that may influence perceptions of these weapons and how that can complicate a Western audience's view on a conflict. For instance, many fights in Eastern Europe and in North Africa and the Middle East, these are American allies using these weapons, but media sources or even cultural consumption may confuse that and confuse who's an ally and who's not. And so these kinds of things are particularly challenging to understand for audiences that aren't digesting, these artifacts in maybe a purposeful way, right? We do a lot of this kind of in the background, which is very interesting. The other thing is this symbol of revolution or rebellion, right? I'm not saying that means the same thing, but that Kalashnikovs have, it sometimes superseded the symbol of an enemy. And you'd actually see in a lot of American media these weapons used in this way. I think I have pictures here that might be useful. Yeah, so the interesting thing about these pictures, all right, so that is Mikhail Kalashnikov holding his weapon in the top left there, right? And that's an AK-47 of some stripe, right? There's a million variants of it, but that's the generic one. Now,
Mad Pakistanis have a very deep relationship with AK-47.
right,
Charlie
exactly.
Wilson. Charlie
Yeah.
Wilson War.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's right. I love that movie. It's
And
very,
the
very
book.
good.
Yeah.
But right it's a well-known weapon design in it's the Soviet Union, developed in China, used throughout South Asia, used throughout the Middle East, used throughout Eastern Europe, South America. And certain conflicts are particularly interesting, like Ireland, the Northern Irish conflict. You saw these weapons, both of these weapons, the M16 family of weapons and AK, next to each other, and it wasn't always obvious, which party would have which weapon. Now, how I looked at these symbols and how I use text here, right, is that this symbol of revolution, it was not just in analyzing or representing historical things. So this picture with Matt Damon and this kind of science fiction AK-47 with that yellow scope that's on it, that's a movie called Elysium, which is a science fiction film about like class struggle and things like that. That is obviously like a futuristic weapon, but it is very clearly based on an AK-47. And these are the people kind of rising up and fighting these elites in society. Now, interestingly, in the bottom left corner here, the gentleman wearing all gray with the kind of tan jacket holding the Kalashnikov style weapon, that could be, anything. Does anyone know what that's from? I'll be shocked if you do. So that could be any representing conflict from the 70s or 80s. That's actually from the recent TV show on Disney called Andor. It's a Star Wars movie. It's incredible that this super futuristic, spaceships and lasers and have this weapon. And why is that? Well, these people are like revolutionaries. They're like rebelling against this oppressive kind of regime. And so this symbol, my argument is that it held not just in history, not just because they were useful, and right, these are useful weapons. I mean, I'm not saying they're not. I'm not saying there aren't reasons why you'd use it, material reasons. But this symbol holds in even cultural context as you move forward. I think so this is the kind of stuff that I was looking at and analyzing these texts and kind of juxtaposing with the way culture went. Now, my lasers and autonomous system chapter, these are used significantly less in the real world. They have been, right? So you can't draw on decades of use. Now, lasers are used in different ways. Obviously, we have lasers in medicine and stuff like that. But on the battlefield, they haven't been used in kind of the way you think of in culture. They're not like rifles that are blasting holes through people. They're, to designate targets, to convey information. We have instances of blinding lasers, but, we have a convention against that. They really haven't been used that way. Significantly. So this is why I had this chapter. This chapter in particular relied on text analysis. Now, remember, we talk about, that your method should match the questions you have. And so I said, well, if I want to know the symbols of these things, I can't just look at how they've been used. I need to look at culture. And this is partly why I delved into this so heavily, because in this regard, I needed to look at like science fiction and fiction because it's one of the major sources of understanding. Now, is that accurate to how these technologies are used? Maybe not. But does it influence policymakers and how they may develop these technologies? I think at least a little bit. And that's kind of my argument. That was my argument there. So that was kind of my approach with my dissertation. So we'll go back here. Um, and that's kind of where we can wrap up the section here on how I've used text analysis and the why. Now, the thing that I just want us to get across is this is a tool in the toolkit, right? It's one of many. You can do many, many things. If you identify your question, you can then hypothesize what you think the answer might be. You can then assess what data you need and then how to collect that. And that, I think, is really the important kind of cascade of information and work you need to do when you're designing research at whatever level and in whatever context. If you're doing a large research paper, a dissertation, a thesis, you're going to be very purposeful about that cascade of information. That's how you're going to move forward. If you're doing a smaller thing, or even a policy paper, you may not outline every step of that, but you're probably going to be doing that work in your head, even in a more quick kind of capacity. And if you're doing policy work where you're doing recommendations for policymakers, again, you might not outline all of that because you can only write a little bit, right? People are going to read 1 or 2 pages. It's probably a good idea to know the questions you have that are informing your recommendation and what you've done to collect it. Because if someone says, well, I think this is incomplete, it's good for you to be able to say to yourself, well, I've already thought about that and here's why, right? So I think that's where I'll wrap my kind of, lecture portion of this at you all. And I'm happy to take questions about anything and we can see where we go here.
Thank you so much, Matt. This has been really, really fascinating. And I'm, really glad that you have shared your research to tell us, how to think about, bigger issues, like each category of weaponry, whether it's nuclear weapons, small arms, or autonomous, it carries the symbolic meaning that you researched, and it extends beyond just the battlefield use. I think it helps all of us think about how global narratives are shaped about power, control, resistance, and existential fear in different yet interconnected ways. And so there are certain thematic, parallels that, bridge all these categories. So it's really, really useful way of thinking. So thank you so much for that. Um, I did you say that you have an exercise, or do you want to do the Q&A?
I do have a short exercise. Do you want to do that first or do you want to do a Q&A first? I don't know if people want to take a breather from having to, well, either way, I mean, because they won't be listening to me.
Are there any questions from the floor right now directly, related to the lecture? So please raise your hand and then we can move to the small exercise, that Matt has for us. Anybody? Your own, Dr. Vakasia, you had been writing in the chat. It seems that your own research, has dealt with some of it. Would you want to say something? I don't know why Pakistanis are so shy, you know.
I need to ask a question. Can I?
Oh, please, Farwa, go ahead.
Hi, Matthew. My question is about the role of perception. So, what is the role of perception in text interpretation? And how does it impact your research outcomes?
Right.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think a really seminal piece, I think most people would agree with me, is the guy Robert Jervis, Perception and Misperception in International Politics. I mean, this is like, it's gigantic, the book, by the way. So, apologies that I send you down this road and it takes forever to read. But it's important, I think, because it doesn't speak to this specific approach. But in general, this idea that the information conveyed may not be digested in the same way, I think is incredibly important. I think it's like kind of the heart of what these are. And I think this is why I particularly use symbols, was a bit to overcome this challenge of perception. Because symbols, I think, are uniquely shared by a culture, right? They're embedded, and people may interpret them differently, but in a way that we can understand, not in the way that individuals misperceive each other, but rather, if I have, so I'll use the Kalashnikov as an example, right? If I'm have a sign with a Kalashnikov on it outside the United States Capitol, that's going to have a very different meaning, right? Than in a country where the military is using that, and it may be more patriotic or nationalistic, right? And so, the perception of that in contexts is important. But I think that is kind of the heart of it. So like the Northern Ireland conflict is an interesting one where the Catholics often got Kalashnikovs because they were funneled, they were kind of bought by people in Boston, where I sit, and then funneled back up into Ireland. The Kurds, great example, like Iraqi Kurds or various Kurdish factions. Most of them are pretty strongly not allied, but in partnership with the United States, especially in the fight against ISIS in recent years. The perception in the West was so weak on who the Kurds are and what they stand for. The British actually tried to send their weapons, the L-85s, to them to use them. Problem is they didn't send them the bullets. So they had a bunch of guns that didn't have anything to shoot. So there was some like understanding of that perception in the international sphere. So I think perception is super important. I think it's really difficult to overcome any individuals, right? So when we do studies of individual leader behavior, I think a lot of the work that gets done is what their perception is, right? That's a lot of the heavy lift. We probably can't do that. Even in this class, right? There's 20 or 19 or 20 of us sitting here. All of us have different histories and contexts that would be really hard to unpack individual perception and how much symbols weigh on us. But we can at least look at the symbol and understand like the broad strokes, I think. So thank you for that question. I think that's partly why I look at questions the way I do, is because of that very issue, that perception matters so much, that we can at least look at things that we share, I think, and that helps us. So very, very good. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Dr. Vakasia, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Hello, Matthew. Hello, Dr. Rabia. This is very interesting, the way you are analyzing the different symbols which are being used, the framing strategies that are being used. I basically have a linguistic background. And I was just thinking about the images that were created during the first Afghanistan war, when we were US allies, and the Afghans having the long beard and carrying the rocket launchers on their shoulders. It was such a pride moment for everyone, and a kind of the pride moment of being Muslims was created, and then afterwards, the second Afghan war, when the whole symbol was changed. I mean, then we didn't like that image of having the Afghans with rather it was a kind of image that created hatred by the West and by here people. So this is very interesting how the symbols, how the framing is creating the narrative, and how the people are reacting to that. And the other thing, Matthew, you have just mentioned about the perceptions are very relative, when we are living in different societies like here. And I was reading this article that I have shared in the chat as well, about the narrative that is created in Indian media about the nuclear bomb. So here also in Pakistan, we can very aptly relate that we say that, okay, we will not eat anything, we will eat grass, but we will make a nuclear bomb. So that's a very famous slogan here. So how this narrative is built, and it is based on the perceptions, and it is it varies from society to society. So this is very interesting, actually. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate the commentary a lot. You actually used a lot of terms that I think helped influence my own interest in this approach. And so I think it's good to unpack this. So in addition to symbols, right? That's the term I decided to use. But it's, you said like a language background or a linguistics background, right? So semiotics are so important in that tradition, right? And so that was part of what did it. Narrative formation. So narrative is something that's become more and more studied in politics, especially international relations. I'm trying to see. I'm sitting here with a book somewhere. Oh, right here. Narrative and the Making of U.S. National Security. And then here, movies, myth, and the national security state, right? So this idea that like narrative is important. But then I love that you mentioned framing. So I have like in my back pocket, I used to study social movements, and within social movement research, framing analysis is huge. And I think I really appreciate that you brought up all of these different terms, because part of it was, it's a lot to handle one field, but to draw data from linguistics, communications, cultural analysis, technology studies, political science, history, whatever, right? This is one of the challenges as researchers, I think, is understanding where your data's come from and the environment it is in, right? As we talked about before. So I'm speaking to a particular field. Like I wrote to political scientists. And, Rabia, your tradition is a security studies academic, right? So you skirt that barrier between history and political science. And I think
Very difficult to manage history and political science in the US.
yeah. And we at UConn, so we have political science and we have that diplomatic history in the history department. They considered us, crappy history. And we would consider them like under theorized political science, right? So those things matter. So it's really good. I love bringing up all the variety of ways that we look at these political situations, because for me, I use symbols as a way to rectify and use all of those traditions. I'm not saying I'm doing justice to all of them, just that when I pull the data in, I've created my, this is the reference that I use. And so again, when we think about methodology, this is my justification for this approach. And then how do I do that? I have these various methods to do that.
Excellent. So Matt, we'll end at 10:30 and let people prepare for their first fast in the morning.
Great.
We'll take your question and then we'll move to the exercise that Matt has. Go ahead. And one last question from Dr. Khushbu.
Thank you so much, Matt. This has been fascinating. You talked about Jervis's classic 1976 book, but I also want to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that your research about symbols is also related to what Schelling worked in relation to focal points and tacit bargaining, because tacit, at the end of the day, the induction of weapons of various kinds and types are a process in a larger scheme of things, which we know as tacit bargaining between two adversaries. So that is, I think, a very useful framing to look at symbols. Symbols are very important when it comes to non-verbal communication between adversaries in and during peace times and in crises.
Signaling.
Yep, yeah. The other thing I want to point out, last in 2024, a book came out, Dead Dust, on radiological weapons, And the key questions that these four authors, including Dr. William Potter, um, answered was why people did not use, why no country did not use any radiological device despite having them in their arsenals. And Dr. Akhtar also reviewed the book for International Affairs, and uh, they used a military innovation lens to analyze all that using the structured focus comparison, and there was a consensus in all case studies that the Russians and the Americans and even the Egyptians, they thought that, oh, this is just a loose uh, amalgamation of radioactive materials, and it's not romantic enough. So I think your research is fascinating, and it compels us to think along multiple lines which have been discussed in the past and which can be very useful research projects going forward.
Thank you. Yeah, that tacit understanding is, I think, so big because so part of my argument that I didn't really get into here that I think really speaks to that the point you made about like the tacit understandings and the focal points. A lot of times experts in the fields of military technology believe they're above influence in a way that the public isn't. And I strongly disagree with that. I think even if people are very informed about the technical or strategic details of a weapon, that knowledge is born of a shared cultural background. And I think about, pilots. Well, modern day American pilots, you are influenced by the movie Top Gun, or now the movies, Top Gun and the new Top Gun. You are. And my strong proof for this is that Top Gun is a Navy program in the United States, and the Air Force was recruiting when the new movie came out outside the movie. They know that that's what gets people to fly planes. Even though it's not their service, they used it. So I think that's that kind of idea that experts even are influenced by these tacit understandings and these embedded things is good. Also, that Death Dust is a great book if people haven't read it about radiological weapons and weapons programs. So not nuclear in the sense of nuclear explosion, but dirty bombs. Sarah Bidgood, one of the co-authors, has made her way around managing the atom. She's outstanding if you ever get a chance to interact with her. In addition, of course, to the big name on the docket, William Potter. But Sarah is really up and coming, rising star, and she's outstanding too. I think we had one more question, right?
Yes, Dr. Khushbu, do you still want to ask the question?
I just want to say that you have pointed out framing, and I was just thinking about the multidisciplinary research. In this type of research, when we carry out as a student of defense and diplomatic studies, and when we are going through this ethnographical study as well, so don't you think that triangulation can be helpful in coming to some conclusions as a
Yes.
strategy selection?
Yeah, I think that is very useful. And now triangulation. So can you give me a little bit more clarity on what you mean by a triangulation? Because I think there's a couple ways that it's useful, but I want to make sure I'm speaking to the right one.
For selection, for research methodology, and for all those things for carrying out these type of research when you are concerned about any political issue or this warlike situation, when we are going to analyze that. So in that context, I was just thinking about this thing.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. And I think, drawing on a lot of different data sources also, that's an important piece of it, right? That you're using all of them to find where they're actually pointing you and to find an area of common ground to kind of understand these broader issues. Because, I mean, the reality of the study of, social science is that we're dealing with complicated people and complicated systems with complicated information. And so finding the core of what's important. We don't need to get into this, but Bayesian logic rather than frequentist logic is what we often use, I argue. And so that I think cuts to the core of, the idea that we're triangulating this information. So I think I'm speaking to that well, and I appreciate that that comment.
Thank you, Matt. So, yeah, we can wrap it up with your exercise.
So what I can do is I can put this up. I can discuss why it's useful. We don't have to do it right now,
Sure.
but if you want to, if your students want to write this down and think
We'll
about
have the
this,
recording of this up on their, platforms. So they will have access to your entire slides. So if you
great,
just walk through this, that would be great.
great. So the exercise here, and this is, I think, a way it's useful to do, especially for if you're looking at master's thesis or a dissertation coming up, or thinking about an article you may want to write. This is kind of, I think, the starting point. And this is very basic. So, but I think it's good to do sometimes, take a step back. Just think of, do this one at a time, okay? Think of a political situation you find interesting. What is an interesting thing to you, or sparks a question? What is the question? If right now, the Ukraine situation is stressful and you're thinking about it and you say, boy, maybe I'm more interested in like Europe's response to Zelensky's meeting with Trump, right? Then what do I think, what do I think influences this? I think the Europeans are going to side with Zelensky because they dislike Trump, right? And so and then what information do I need, right? I need to see there, if that's my argument, what's the proof that Trump has inflamed relations with Russia or Europeans, and the way that Europeans have started to express dislike towards Trump that they didn't towards Biden, right? How do I do that? What information do I need? And then the next is, how do you get it? And this is the part, right? You don't want to write an article that you already have an answer to. You need to think about things. That's how you build. This is why we talk about positivism. This is how I think you build knowledge. I'm not saying what you do is going to be universal or even has to be. I'm just saying if you use this approach to come up with a question, you're going to be contributing to something new. And it also allows you to look into it. Maybe someone's already tried to address it. And that doesn't mean you can't talk about it anymore, but it gives you an ability to say what you're saying is different and why you're saying what you're saying is different. So this I think is a useful exercise to do if you're kind of looking for a new idea. I think this is a great way to do it.
I think this is fascinating, Matt, and thank you so much for this direction. And, all of us actually can undertake this, in our own time. There's so many interesting questions out there. And also, with the broader, Matt's own research that he has presented, I have just posted a trajectory for you if you're thinking about building up on his research, or you want to work in the same domain as he has. Then there is a lot of food for thought here. Just going back to Matt's own research, I'm asking, are we entering a new era of symbolic warfare? Because each of the weapons, for example, that he's talked about defines an era. Cold War nuclear fear era, post-colonial conflicts and AK-47 and guerrilla warfare era. And then is the 21st century going to be symbolized by autonomous AI-driven war? So there are many interesting ideas here for your own research and how you think about it. And I'm extremely grateful to you, Matt, for talking to us. If you can close the slide, we'll just, yeah,
There we go.
have you in the spotlight for everyone. So thank you so much for sharing these, very interesting, thought-provoking thoughts with us. And I'm sure that everybody has benefited from listening to you, engaging with you. I really, really appreciate it. And we'll continue this conversation. We will also be putting this video up for broader audience on our CISPA YouTube channel, because there are many students out there who, are interested in research methods, and we have very, very few experts, that we bring to the fore. So thank you so much for joining us here. And I really appreciate everybody's time and commitment to this, and especially to Matt for doing this on a Saturday on your weekend. So thank you so much, Matt. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you to everyone, and Ramadan Mubarak for those that are undertaking their fast. Good luck.
Thank you so much. Peace out, everybody. Have a great first fast and have a great month of Ramadan ahead. I'll see you guys later. Bye.